We're going to talk today primarily about tubes and sweeps and kind of more curving three-dimensional objects. We've been dealing with the basic rectangles. It's now time to get into something a little bit more complicated. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through it. I will do it live. I don't think that you'll be able to follow me along step by step all the way through and get to the end when I get to the end. I think I'll end up losing you along the way. So try not to overly concentrate on trying to follow me step by step and understand the big picture of what I'm trying to do. Understand what a sweep is and that sort of thing. In the beginning, of course, you can try to kind of keep along with me. But I caution you against that because the last thing that I want is for you to be trying to do something and then I've moved on and then you get lost and you didn't hear what I was trying to tell you and then you're completely lost. And so we don't want that. So just kind of track with me a little bit as we get going through this. So the thing that we're making today is something called a spider clamp. If we do a Google image search for this, it might give you a little bit more context. It's something along these lines. So it's this little clamp thing that clamps 4 panes of glass together. And there's a variety of styles to how they come together and what the little the rods look like, etc. But this is essentially the basics of what we're modeling. You know, something like this is far more intricate than what we're modeling. We're simplifying it, but I want to have you guys have a general idea of what these are and how they work together. So the idea is that you have this little clamp, you have a rod that comes out, and then you have a tension line that's holding the glass together. So you're using tension to keep the structural forces at bay as you do this. So we're building this little tiny component, the cable lines, and then also a pane of glass that will eventually assemble together into a big wall of this stuff. So sometimes it helps just to see visually what it is that we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start. I'm going to work in the perspective view to start. I did choose large object inches as my template. I noticed a couple of you last class got through the exercise and then realized you were working in millimeters and we had to do some scaling and whatever. So I'm just reminding everybody, double check at the bottom here, right down here that it says inches. You want that inches to be active. Interesting. Well, it's a good thing we're not using V-Ray today. By the way, the computers have been acting up all day. So if your computer acts up, I apologize, but that's the way it's been. So I am in inches, so we can go ahead and start working. And what I'm going to start with is drawing the shape that you see in part 1, step 1 right here, which is essentially a 2-inch radius curve, a 13-inch straight section, and another 2-inch radius curve. And so as I start to draw that, I'll go ahead and start with the curve tool. And this is one of those things where we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we create this. I'm just going to start with the basic arc, center, start, and end. And when I do that, the center of the arc, I'm going to go ahead and move it over 2 inches. So the center in coordinates, if I was starting right here at the origin, would be 2, 0. I didn't put an @ sign in it, just 2, 0. That would get me started. And then the origin here would be 0, 0. That would be the start of my arc. And the end of my arc, I just need it to be 90 degrees. So I can go ahead and turn on my ortho here. And it's going to be right there. And so that creates that first little bit of the arc. You could create it in a different way. You could create the line first and then work from the line. I mean, there's lots of flexibility here in terms of how you actually create it. Next thing I need is I need a polyline. And I'll start by snapping to this endpoint. Currently my snaps are not on, so I'll go ahead and turn on my end, mid, and perpendicular snaps. Those are the 3 that I like to have on as I work. And I'll snap right to that corner, and I'll draw over by 13 inches. So it's just the length here. There's my 13 inches, and I can go ahead and finish by pressing enter again. Now I need this arc over here. I could do the same thing. I could mirror this arc, but I could also just create the arc again. So there's the start and the center. So in this, I would want to come down 2 inches to get that center. We'll start right there, and we'll end right there. And that gives me that piece of the arc as well. So I have this piece, and this piece. I'd like all of those to become one continuous curve, and I'll do that by selecting them, and then going up to Edit, and then Join. So that makes them one continuous curve, and of course the middle here disappeared because of that error in V-Ray that I haven't, or in Rhino that I haven't changed yet. So let me go to Tools, and then Options, scroll all the way down to View, expand that, click on OpenGL, and uncheck that GPU tessellation option. And there we go. Now I can see my object. Okay, so I have a continuous line that starts with this arc, goes straight, and then comes back here. But I'd like it to be standing up in the third dimension. So it's currently flat on the ground. I drew it flat. You could confirm that by looking at it in the top view. Yep, there it is. So I want it to be three-dimensional. I want it to be standing up. So I'll use my rotate 3D command. We've done this before. I'll go up to my transform. I'll choose rotate 3D. Alternatively, I could type rotate 3D into the command line. I'll choose my curve and press enter. And then the start of the rotation axis, that is this axis right here, because I want these 2 points to be down on the ground. So I'll snap to this first point, snap to the second point. That's my rotation axis. My reference is going to be going up the y-axis here. And then I'm just going to fold it up till it's standing at perfect 90 degrees. Remember, if I didn't have ortho turned on, I could hold down Shift on the keyboard and get it to line up perfectly vertical, like that. So all I've done is I've taken that curve that I drew, and I've now made it so that it's standing up, like that. So the next piece of this is to go ahead and draw a circle that is right here where we start. So I'm going to come over to my tools here, and I'm going to choose circle. Now in this option, it's asking for the center of the circle, so I would pick the center of the circle there. The next thing here is that it's asking me for the radius of the circle. Well, the little picture that's hard to read here shows a diameter of 0.5. So a diameter of a ½ inch, which would mean the radius is 0.25. So I'd type in 0.25 and press enter, and that would give me a circle with a diameter of a ½ inch or a radius of a ¼ inch. Alternatively, when you're creating that circle, you could, there I am, switch to diameter mode and type in 0.5, since you know that it's the diameter of 0.5. So pay attention on this exercise as to whether I'm telling you what the diameter is or what the radius is, so that these little pieces aren't too big. Okay, so what I have now is I have something that's a curve, and I have something that defines the cross-section of an ultimate shape. So I'm going to use a command called a sweep. And what a sweep does is it takes a curve, so in this case, this curve here, and it calls that a rail. And it's kind of like, you could think of it like a railroad track. You have a train running on a railroad track, and there's a rail on one side. That train's going to stay on the track, and it's just going to keep following it. So what we're doing here is we're saying, I want this curve to follow this rail and give me a surface as it follows along. So it's kind of like the follow me tool in SketchUp, if you've worked with that before, though it works a whole lot better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my surface, and I'm going to choose to sweep one rail. Alternatively, I could type in sweep one, and I'll go ahead, and the first thing it asks me is to select the rail. So the rail in this case is this curve right here. I'll go ahead and press, oh, I don't have to press enter because I'm only selecting one curve. Then it asks me to select the cross-section curve. So the cross-section curve would be this curve right here, that little circle. When I'm done now, I'll go ahead and press enter. It asks me, do I want to drag the seam to adjust? This is just where the seam of the surface would be. The default is almost always just fine. So we're going to leave it right where it is. That's fine. And we'll go ahead and press enter. This then brings up the Sweep One Rail Options dialog box. So by default, the frame style is called freeform. And I'll explain the difference of these a little bit better when I do some other examples here. But essentially that means as this curve happens, follow along with the curve, with that cross-section, and make it look kind of like a pipe. So we'll stick with that. I'll explain roadlike in a little bit. And we'll go ahead and come down here. The rest of the options are just fine. And we'll go ahead and say OK. And what I end up with, if I switch to shaded mode, is essentially a tube that follows along that cross-sectional, or that rail that defines what this little tube should look like. So that was a very controlled example. You know, alternate to that, right? I could take, oops, sorry about that, wrong view. Turn back into perspective here. I could make any curve that I wanted, like this, and I could start with a cross-sectional curve, like that. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. Let's say it's something like that. Now in this context here, oops, the cross-sectional curve is flat compared to this curve, so I need to rotate that up. So let me take the cross-sectional curve here. It's either the cross-sectional curve or it's this curve. One of them has to rotate up. So I'll just take the cross-sectional curve. We'll rotate that 3D. So I'll go to Transform, Rotate 3D. All right, so now that's standing up. And if I go back to the Sweep 1, I can go in here to my Surface, Sweep 1 Rail. I can choose my rail, then my cross-sectional curve, and press Enter. There's the seam. And then it will build that in whatever shape it is that I want. So that's flat still. If I take this curve and I change it and I manipulate some of these control points, let me go ahead and move them vertically. We'll pull those up, and maybe we'll pull these two up a little bit too. Okay, so now that same curve is now going up and down in space. I can do the same sweep. So I can go into Surface. I could go to Sweep 1 Rail, Rail, cross-sectional curve, Enter, Enter, and now it's created, you know, a three-dimensional little pipe there. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so what about if my cross-sectional curve isn't a pipe anymore? So let's say instead of a pipe, I say I want something that's a rectangle. So let me do a rectangle. And again, I'm exaggerating some of this so you guys can see it here a little bit. Let me delete that. I need to do some rotations on this one to get it to fall right. Let me rotate 3D. And in this context, I'm going to fold it down so it's below where we're starting here. And I'm also going to rotate this a little bit with a regular rotation. So let me go to Transform and then Regular Rotate. And I'm just going to pull that over. So it's a little more perpendicular to where I start. So now I can do the same thing. I can do my Sweep 1 Rail. So I'll go up to Surface, Sweep 1 Rail. There's my rail. There's my cross-sectional curve. When I press Enter, we're going to start to see some differences. So right here, my frame style is set as freeform. And so if you look at this, as it starts to come up, you see how it kind of arcs around the curve. And then it arcs back, and then it ends up right here, such that my ending point is on an angle where this is flat. If I switch to road-like, it's going to keep this like a path, where the top is always going to be flat. So instead of being able to twist and bank, it's going to keep that a stationary surface as it goes up and down, which may or may not be what you want from a modeling standpoint. But the point is that there's a distinct difference each time with how you do it. So we'll say that road-like top is OK. I'll go ahead and say OK, and there is my resulting surface, kind of like a path or something that's going around a particular object. Okay? So that's when I switch to road-like top versus freeform. So now the other option, I'm going to duplicate an edge. So I'm going to type dupe edge, and I'm going to duplicate this edge right there. So that, and let me get rid of the original surface. Now I have both edges of that sweep. So there's technically two rails now. But I'm going to modify this one a bit. Or maybe actually I'm going to modify this one because it has fewer control points. It makes life a little bit easier. So let me take this, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger by moving these 2 points out, like that. And you know what? Maybe I'll move these 2 points out a little bit too. Or, for argument's sake, I'll move them closer. So I've manipulated those rails. They're no longer parallel. We've previously done a Sweep 1 Rail, where this rail has defined, with this cross-section, the end result. I can switch from a Sweep 1 to a Sweep 2 by going into Surface, Sweep 2 Rails this time. So the first rail would be this one. The second rail would be that one. So this is a little bit more like a railroad track, where I have a rail on each side. But in this sense, when I go ahead and select the cross-sectional curve right there and press enter, there's my seam, I'll press enter, the cross-section is going to get larger as I get to the curves where they're further apart. So you see how that cross-section gets larger? It also gets kind of really funky in this section because they're getting closer together and not getting small enough. We have a couple other options here. We can try to rebuild the cross sections. That's smoothing them out a little bit. Refitting isn't going to help us too much, but you guys get the idea here. So in this case, I'm not sure this ended up working out to turn out that well. I probably needed to make this bigger rather than smaller to get a good result out of it. But I like to show you what the sweep 1 rail does. Or excuse me, the sweep 2 rails does versus the sweep 1 rail. The one last thing that I'm going to point out, let me go ahead and delete this. I'll delete the inner one. And that is that the cross-sectional curve does not have to be centered on or touching the rail itself. I could take this cross-sectional curve and I can move it so that it's not even close to where that rail would be. So it's floating out here in space. And I could do the same, sweep 1. There's my rail, there's my cross-sectional curve, enter, enter, and it's going to build it, maintaining the distance between this rail and my cross-sectional curve. So it's important to note that the relationship of the two doesn't have to be in the same plane or attached to one another. I think sometimes visually it makes sense to have it like, oh, it's at the center of this object or it's at the side of this object, but it doesn't have to be. And that's something that's important to keep in mind as we work through our sweeps. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those objects because they have nothing to do with what I was building, but I think it helps illustrate what a sweep is and how we work with a sweep. So there's my original object. I'm going to Z for zoom, followed by S for selected to recenter my view around that particular object. And then I need to keep building. So at this point, I'm going to create a little button that goes on the end. That's kind of the clamp that holds the glass. So if we jump back to my images here, you can see that there's these little discs that kind of hold the glass. We're building those little discs right now. And so I'm going to do, instead, I could extrude a curve, but I can also go into my standard shapes and choose a cylinder, because essentially that's what it is. So I'll pick cylinder. It's going to ask me for the base of the cylinder. I'm going to pick the very center of this object right there. Then it's going to ask me for a radius. So in here I have the diameter set at 1.5 inches, so the radius would be 3/4 of an inch. Or I can click on diameter and choose 1.5. Next thing I need to do is I need to choose whether it is going down or going up. So in this case it's going down, so I'll do negative 0.25. So it's negative 1/4 of an inch going down. And that then creates this little button. I can do the same thing on the other end, or I could just mirror this to the other side, but for the repetition of it I'll do it again. I'm going to choose to create another cylinder. I'm going to snap this end point, I hope. In this case it doesn't like me, so I might have to turn it upside down so I can see it there. There we go. I'm still in diameter mode at 1.5 inches. That's great. And I'm going to be going down negative 0.25 to create that part of the clamp as well. So I have this button and I have this button. Now, the way that these clamps work, there's actually a hole in the glass. So this piece of metal is on one side of the glass, then there's a hole in the glass, and the structure goes through, and then there's a clamp on the other side, and the two press together to hold the glass. So I need to create another one of these that's down even a little bit further. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one, and I'm going to use the copy command. So I'll go to transform and then copy, point to copy from, and then I also have the ability to copy vertical. So in this case, vertical is a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and click on vertical. And then point to copy from. It doesn't really matter where we pick. I'll say right there. And then I can specify a distance. Now I need there to be 1/2 of an inch between these two. So a 1/2 inch plus the 1/4 inch thickness of this would be 3/4 of an inch. So I can type in 0.75 inches. Now when I do that, it's going to create that lower one. Oh, excuse me. I have to type in negative 0.75. My fault. There we go. Now it creates that. I'll press delete. So I'll do that one again. I'll take the cylinder here. I'm going to go to transform and then copy. Point to copy from, oh, I need to be vertical. We'll say right there. This needs to go down by 0.75 inches, so I need a negative 0.75 inches. And that then creates the lower part of this. So you can see that I've created this tube, and then I've created these two clamps on either end to hold that panel of glass. Make sense so far? All right. So I have that. The next part of this, now that I've created this, is that I need one going in each direction. So this one here, I'm going to ultimately rotate by 45 degrees. So I can go ahead and use my regular rotate. I'll go up to transform and then rotate. It's not a 3D rotate. It's just a regular rotate. I can start right at my, my center, so I could snap right to the center there. I could also type in 0, 0. And this time, I'm going to start there, and I'm going to go up to 45 degrees. So this is a good opportunity to actually type in 45. So I want to rotate by exactly 45 degrees. And now that one is rotated like that. I need a second copy of this so that I can have one going the opposite direction, going this way. So when I create that one, I have two different ways of doing it. And I'm going to show you both methods here. The first way would be to select my object. I'll go ahead and copy it. So I'll go to transform and copy. And I'll pull it over here and I'll make a second copy. So there it is. Then I'll take this copy and I will rotate it. So I'll go to transform and then rotate. And I'll rotate it right around the middle. And so in this case, we're going this direction. I need to rotate it by 180. Or no, by 90, sorry. So I could just type in 90. And that would give me that shape. And then I can move it, again from the center, or the midpoint, so that it matches up with the midpoint over here. Now I'm having trouble snapping to this midpoint because I don't see the curve in here. So this is one where switching your view can be helpful. So we've been working primarily in shaded mode so far. But if instead of working in shaded mode, we work in a mode called ghosted, it's almost shaded mode, but we can see the curve through our objects a little bit. So our objects have a little bit of ghosting to them. That will allow us to pretty easily move from this middle and snap to that middle. And if I did this correctly, if I look at it from the top view, I should see a perfect little X there on a 1-foot square, which is exactly what I wanted to have happen. So I told you there were two different ways of doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that piece, and I'm going to show you the other way. And this has to do with how efficient you can become as you start to work in Rhino. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it this way. There's nothing wrong with making a copy, rotating, and then moving back. But what I would do if I were modeling is I would take this shape. I would go up to copy. So I'd go to transform and then copy. And as soon as I'm in the copy command, I can type I or select this in place option. That means I don't need a base point, just make a copy right on top of itself. So I'll go ahead and click on that. It makes a copy right on top of itself. Notice that the object maintains its selection, so I still have it selected. I can then immediately go into rotate, so I can go to transform and then rotate. I can snap to my midpoint, and I can say 90 and do my rotation. So I've saved the step of copy over here, rotate and move back. I've made a copy in place and just rotated the copy. So it's a more efficient way of working. It doesn't mean that it's the way you have to do it right now. I just like to introduce that as a concept for your modeling speed and technique. So at this point, I've made this little X that's going to hold our glass. I need to make the extension rod that comes up off the top of this. And that extension rod, if we flip the page over, is from the base, it's 2 feet to the center of the little cable. Alternatively, from our from the top of our little spider clamp thing here, it's 1 foot 9 1/4. So I'm going to go ahead and make it from the base, and then we'll trim it off afterward. And I'll do that by using the same commands that I've been doing. So the first one I'll choose is polyline, and I'm just going to make it flat on the ground here. I'll turn on ortho so that I'm straight, and I'll do this at 2 feet. There we go. And there's my polygon. Next thing I'll do is I'll create my cross-sectional curve. And in this case, it is also a 1/2 inch diameter steel rod. So my diameter, listed up there, would be 0.5. There it is. I need to rotate that shape three-dimensionally so that it stands up. So I'd go to rotate 3D. Alternatively, I could rotate this line. Ultimately, the line's going to have to be rotated, so it might be more efficient to do it that way. I'll go to rotate 3D and stand this line up. So there's my axis of rotation, and we can stand that up so it's standing vertically. I could then do my sweep. So I'll go to surface, sweep one rail, rail, cross-sectional curve, enter, enter, and it creates, oh, one more enter, and it creates that shape. Now the astute observer here would say, well, wait a minute, couldn't I also just go and create a cylinder right here with a diameter of 0.5 and a height of 2 feet? Absolutely. So this cylinder is exactly the same as this piece. The only difference is that this cylinder has a top and a bottom on it. We're going to get rid of the top and the bottom anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So that's the thing about Rhino. There's always multiple ways of creating a particular object. I'd like to show you this, and of course today I'm emphasizing the sweeps, so I'm going to keep doing it via sweeps. But I want you to be aware that there are other options for how you would create this. So I now have this little riser here, and then I need a little donut on the end that's going to accept the cable into it. So I'm going to do that, and you can see it that the outside diameter of that little donut is 1 3/4 inches. So this would be an opportunity to use my curve. Once again, so I'm creating a circle. I'll snap right here to the center, and I would set my diameter at 1.75 inches. Now, in this view, I would have to then rotate 3D, so I go to transform, rotate 3D, and we'd stand this up so it was standing up like that. But if I initiated the circle command in this perspective view and then switched my view into, say, the front view, I wouldn't have to do that rotation. See how that changes? So I've changed the working view from perspective, where I started, down into this front view where I can just type in 1.75 inches, and I now have, without having to do the 3D rotate, the shape in the correct direction. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm using the viewports to help myself out. So that's the outer diameter. The steel tension cable is only 3/8 of an inch. That would be the inside diameter. So I could do the same thing. Let me snap to this point, and I'll move into the front view here. And in the front view, my diameter needs to be 3/8 of an inch. So I could type 3/8, or I could type in 0.375 to get 3/8 of an inch. Press enter, and there's that center cable right there. So if we look at it in perspective, we're seeing the center. We're seeing the outside diameter. Now we need one more circle that represents the cross-section of this little donut that we're creating. So if I come back to the circle tool, we've been using the center, the circle center, and the radius. But notice hidden underneath I have some other options, one of which is a circle with the diameter. If I pick that tool, I can actually snap from this edge over to that edge and create a circle that's perpendicular to those two curves. If you're having trouble snapping, you can also turn on the quadrant snap, which will snap to the north, south, east, and west points on a circle. So I could go from there. Oh, sorry, wrong tool. Let me click on this diameter circle and go from quadrant to quadrant like that. So this is set up for a sweep. I can sweep using the outer rail, or I can sweep using the inner rail, either of which is perfectly fine. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to my sweep one rail. So I'll go to surface and then sweep one. There's my rail. There's my cross-sectional curve. I'll press enter and one more enter, and that gives me this little donut on the end. You do have in your shapes here, you have a torus, which is essentially a donut. And so we could do the same thing using the torus tool if we wanted to. Interestingly enough, the sweep makes more intuitive sense to me. Like, that's how I would build it. But that's, again, just a preference. Okay, so if I start to look at this, though, my steel rod that's coming up here intersects this torus, or this donut, at kind of a funky place. And we can see artifacts kind of poking through on the sides. So we need to do some trimming to clean it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to Edit and then Trim. My cutting object is going to be the donut, or the torus. I'll press Enter. And then I can get rid of wherever this rod kind of pokes out. So it pokes out there. That would be clean and through. But I could also take it a step further and get rid of that piece so that I end up with just where the two intersect down here at the bottom. That's a nice clean way of doing it. Go ahead and press Enter to finish, and there it is. I could also use this object as a trim and get rid of the tiny little bit there such that those made a perfect seam. That's really unnecessary because you're not going to worry about it from a rendering standpoint, but I'm pointing it out anyway. So the next part of this is that this object, this one that I just created, needs to line up with this object right here. So if I were to take this object and I were to move it, let me go to Transform and then Move, I could snap from this right to the center of that. Now this is too tall because it's 2 feet from the bottom up to the top, or from where the glass would be. So I actually need to move this down, and I happen to know how far down it is because I drew these curves to begin with. It's 2 inches. The alternative would be that you could move it and then use your side view as a reference point to get it to come down to where it would match those. So in that context, I would go ahead and start the move, vertical, and we could say I want to move from that point right there. But then I could come in here and reference. See how I can reference one of these points? So I could reference right there on the spider or right there on the spider and actually have that snap as it's coming down. So I'm using this view to help guide my placement. So there it is, placed. But again, I have this object fully intersecting with these two objects. So I need to do some cleanup. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Trim. I'm going to select this curve and or this curve. I actually think it's easier to do it one at a time, so I'm going to do just this curve. I'll press Enter, and then I can trim off that lower part right there. And when I do that, it trims all the way up. You can kind of see where it intersects there, like that. I could reach in here a little bit more, and I could try to get rid of more of that. See where the holdover part is. There's a little bit there, that's a little bit there. Whoops, too far, undo. Right, so in that context, I need to trim it a little bit more. You could see, let me illustrate this for just a second. If I hide this, you can see where the intersection has happened with just those two objects. And actually, there's a little bit on this back side that I should get rid of. So let me type trim, and I could get rid of that part of the object there. So you can see how those two are intersecting right now. If I type show, I get the object back, and I could then fix it for this object. So let me hide. Now you can see it against this. I would need to do a little bit more trimming here. So I could say that's my cutting object, trim, and we could get rid of that piece and that piece. It doesn't really matter to trim it all the way as long as you've trimmed it off the bottom and you're not seeing it from the bottom. Let me go back to show, and now I have those two pieces there all trimmed out and nice and neat. I could take it a step further and I could trim out these pieces as well, where those two intersect. That would be reasonable. So I could go into a trim, and I could say, okay, I want to get rid of that piece there, and I want to get rid of that piece there. And then I could use this and this as a trim for that piece and that piece. Essentially, you get how I'm working through this. Again, those are all unnecessary, but it's not bad practice to learn how this trim process works. And essentially what we've ended up doing is we've made it so that there's nothing inside this. It's all hollow as they come together. Okay, so I've gone through and I've done that part of it. I don't need this curve anymore. That's pretty good. All right, I'd like for the center of this to fall right at 0, 0. Or the center of my glass to fall at the bottom of this point, one or the other. So let's go ahead and create the piece of glass. I'm going to just use a box, corner to corner. And for the ease of snapping, I'll go ahead and snap right to the midpoint there. And so this piece of glass is going to be 4 feet by 6 feet. So I can go ahead and type in at relative coordinate here, 4 feet in the x, comma, 6 feet in the y. And my thickness is going to be a 1/2 inch, so 0.5. And I'll go ahead and press enter, and that gives me that pane of glass right there. This needs to be moved down so that it falls in the center of those little buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and type move, or go to transform and then move, and I will specify that this is a vertical move, which it is. And I want it to move down so that it references, and you can see me doing this here, so that it references right there, which means that the spider is going to fall exactly on either side of that glass. Okay, so that falls there. That's nice. You can kind of see how this is going to work, because if I were to take this object and copy it and put it up here, I'd get another of that object, and they would tile together as I make a much larger wall. That's the idea here. So I'm going to go ahead with this object, and I'm going to add a little bit of steel cable going up here. So I'm going to do one more sweep. I'm going to do a line right from the center. There it is. That's going to be at 6 feet so that it matches the height of the, whoops, so that it matches the height, oh, come on, of the glass, 6 feet in that direction. Press enter. I already have the little circle from when I created the donut or the torus, and I can do that using a sweep. So I'll do a sweep 1, my rail, followed by my cross-sectional curve right there. I'll press enter, and then one more enter, and OK. And I end up with that steel cable going up on the side here. So I've now made all the geometry that I need to make. The last thing I need to do is just kind of put it into view so that I can kind of see what it would look like, do a little rendering of it, etc. So